We're so glad that you're tuning in to listen to this sermon. It's part of our weekly worship service here at LOPC, and our hope is that as you listen to it, you'll hear God's word to you. So we're continuing along in our sermon series, Travel Adventures from the Bible, in which we're taking a look at various trips and journeys that were undertaken by people who experienced real change and transformation. Or perhaps the world around them was significantly changed and transformed as a consequence of their trip, of their journey, of their adventure. And today we're going to be taking a look at a biblical character by the name of Nehemiah. And this is drawn from the Hebrew Scriptures. It's a story of something that happened about 2,500 years ago, and yet I think you'll agree it still has some real relevance for us today. Nehemiah, a fascinating biblical character. And as I was looking at his story over the course of the past week, I was reminded of how many trips and how many journeys I've taken over the years simply for the purpose of helping a group of people somewhere regionally or even in the world who found themselves in a difficult place and needed some help, needed some advocacy, needed someone to show up and minister to them in a time of great need. It could be in response to a great tragedy or some kind of ongoing conflict or tension or deprivation, but this is something that I remember doing from the time I was just a little guy. Because the church I was raised in, First Presbyterian Church in San Diego, was deeply committed to these things called mission trips. You ever heard of them? Well, of course you have, because we love them here at LOPC. A mission trip is when we gather a group of people together and we go somewhere. Could be across the street, could be across the county line, could be somewhere nationally or even international, to meet a need, to encounter people who need some help, and to bring some aid and some assistance and some succor to them. That's a mission trip. And I grew up thinking it was the most natural thing in the world to kind of pack everybody up in the car every so often and head off to help orphans or folks who were experiencing some kind of dislocation or maybe a natural disaster of some sort. I just thought, well, that's kind of what you do. That's what Christians do, because it was modeled by my church family, and it was also modeled by my parents. And I took that idea into young adulthood and continued to make those mission trips, and in all the churches that I've served, and I've been privileged to head into all parts of the county and to do national and international trips, and they've really made a profound difference in my life and hopefully brought some good to others. But I think sometimes we need to just stop and think about how really consequential that is, that you and I are part of a community of faith, which is formed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, and believes it's the most natural thing in the world that we hear about trouble or problems or people suffering either close by or at distance, and we think that God might be calling us to do something about it. Do you find that strange? I mean, just think about that for a moment. That's really interesting. That you and I are part of a faith community that when there's a natural disaster, when there's a problem, when there's trouble, when people are suffering or struggling, we think it might be the case that God is calling us to do something about that specific situation. And the reason we think that is because the gospel wants to form us as people who understand that God is the loving parent of all people, and that we have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters, particularly in their time of need, wherever they might be. We can't solve all the problems in the world, but what is God calling us to do? That's what it means to be God's people. And a person who also lived and operated with this kind of spiritual worldview was, as I said, a man by the name of Nehemiah. Nehemiah lived 2,500 years ago, and he was kind of comfortably ensconced in one of the prominent cities of the Persian Empire, a city by the name of Susha. And Nehemiah was a Jew, but he was in exile from his home country, from Israel, Palestine. And the reason for that is that Nehemiah's ancestors had been part of the Babylonian captivity. So in the 6th century, the southern kingdom, Judah, decided to ally with Egypt, and the Babylonians didn't like that. And their response was to send a massive army which destroyed the city of Jerusalem and absolutely ended the southern kingdom of Judah. And for good measure, they took captives, and these were the best and the brightest of the Jewish people, east into Babylon, into the empire, where they could be kind of held as hostages. And Nehemiah was one of the descendants of those original exiles. And even though he and the other exiles were now a few generations into this captivity, and some of them had been allowed to return, but there were many who were still in what has now become the Persian Empire, after the Persian Empire overtook the Babylonian Empire. So this has been going on for decades. They kept their finger on the pulse of what was going on in Jerusalem, because that was their ancestral homeland. And they looked for news. You know, Nehemiah, he'd never been there, but he wanted to know how the people in Jerusalem were doing. Those were his people. Those were Jewish people. And one time, on one occasion, Nehemiah receives news that the Jews in Jerusalem are not doing well. They've been trying to rebuild the temple. They've been trying to gather the people together in some kind of cohesive unit, but they're infighting with each other. The exiles who are returning are not getting along with the Jews who never left. There are adversaries around them that are kind of keeping them from rebuilding the city and re-strengthening the walls, which have fallen into ruin and devastation. And Nehemiah is really concerned about this. And so as a person of faith, he takes it to God in prayer. He gets on his knees in the presence of God, and he asks God to do something about this. And wouldn't you know it, God taps Nehemiah and says, I'm glad you brought it up, Nehemiah. I want you to be my guy. So always be careful when you start praying about a need somewhere in the world, because God might say, I'm glad you brought that up. I need you to work with me to address this phenomenal need in Jerusalem. And fortunately, Nehemiah is actually in a pretty good position to do something, because he's the cupbearer to the king of the Persian Empire, a man by the name of Artaxerxes. And the cupbearer served the king personally. And Nehemiah is in a little bit of a problem or a dilemma here, because it would have breached protocol for him to actually ask the king for anything. Nehemiah was there to serve the king, not to help make policy, right? So he can't actually ask the king for anything. And so he does the next best thing. And this is something, by the way, that I do from time to time when I'm troubled about something and I don't know how to bring it up to Ann. I'll just put on my sad face. Don't laugh at me. I know you do it too. I'm troubled about something. I don't know how to talk about it, or I'm not ready to talk about it. I don't know how to bring it up, so I just put on my sad face. And then Ann will say, honey, what's wrong? So that's what Nehemiah does. He goes into the king's presence as his cupbearer with his sad face on. And that means the king, who was not Jewish, he was probably Zoroastrian, and they believed that when a person was sad, that could be a very bad omen. So the king asks Nehemiah what's wrong, probably more as a way to make sure that no bad mojo comes into his court. But Nehemiah is then able to share the situation in Jerusalem, and remarkably, Artaxerxes gives, as long as he promises to come back, because Artaxerxes was fond of Nehemiah, he gives him the ability and resources to go and address the crisis in Jerusalem. And off goes Nehemiah. And the scripture I'm going to read for you today is what Nehemiah does when he gets to Jerusalem, the first part of his work there. So from Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 to 18, listen for God's word to you this morning. So I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. And then I got up during the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the animal I rode. And I went out by night to the valley gate, past the dragon spring, and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, and its gate that had been destroyed by fire. And then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, and there was so much refuse and rubble, there was no place for the animal I was riding to continue. So I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. And then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so I returned. And then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest that were to do the work. And then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." I told them that the hand of my God had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And then they said, "Let us start building." And so they committed themselves to the common good. Now, the phrase that really pops out at me is this idea that after hearing Nehemiah, these leaders of Israel committed themselves to the common good. That's really what Nehemiah was after. And in this opening to the book that bears his name, we can see just how good a leader Nehemiah actually was. He's widely considered to be one of the greatest leaders represented to us in the pages of the scriptures. This is not to say that we would necessarily today agree with everything that he did. He had some rather controversial decisions as a leader, but by and large, Nehemiah was a phenomenal leader of people. And there are many books that have been written on leadership which actually use Nehemiah as a model. He was that good. And we can see how excellent a leader he was by just these opening verses to the story that's laid out for us in the book that bears his name. The first thing we can see is that Nehemiah shows up in Jerusalem, but he doesn't share with anybody who he is or why he is there. What does he do for 3 days? He listens. That's a very, very good leader. He shows up in a situation that's new and novel and strange. It's conflicted. The leaders, the Jewish leaders, are at each other's throats. The poor and those who are most needy and most vulnerable are not being taken care of. It's just a mess symbolized by the ruination of the walls. And what does he do? He listens for 3 days to get a lay of the land. And then the second thing that Nehemiah does is he goes out under cover of darkness to survey how bad things really are with the walls. He has to have a firsthand perspective on the devastation. He's not going to wait for someone else to do it. He's not going to depend on someone else. He goes himself in a way where he cannot be distracted, where he's not going to be supervised or influenced in any way to make his own decision and develop his own opinion on the state of affairs in Jerusalem there with the walls. That's a good leader. And then the third thing that Nehemiah does is when the time is right, and only when the time is right, he calls everyone together, all of these leaders, religious and political, that are kind of duking it out. And he sits them down and he reveals who he is and what King Artaxerxes has commissioned him to do, and how God has also charged him with this task. And then he points out to them systematically everything that is wrong with Jerusalem, the way that people are being taken advantage of, the lack of justice, the way that the walls have been allowed to deteriorate, just the overall devastation and destruction and ruination. He points it out to them and he said, this shame and this disgrace must not continue. And he lays it at their feet. He tells them the truth. And then he steps forward and presents a plan, which is something that a good leader does. And miracle of miracles, they heard what he had to say, and how did they respond? Positively. They said, okay, let's get to it. And the most important thing they did, as I said, was they committed themselves to the common good. That means that prior to Nehemiah showing up, they weren't committed to the common good. What were they committed to? Their own personal good. They were in it for themselves. In a lack of order, in a lack of community, when times are divisive, people just tend to look after their own personal good, and they lose sight of the common good, what's good for everyone. And Nehemiah, he knew that that's the kind of society, that's the kind of culture, that's the kind of community life that God is never, ever going to bless. In fact, Nehemiah was of the opinion, and this is one that had developed rather robustly by the time he took his mission trip to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was of the opinion that the reason God had allowed the Babylonians to come in and lay waste to Jerusalem was because the religious and the political leaders of Israel and Judah had so mistreated one another, and they had not attended to justice, and they had not looked out for those who were vulnerable and those who were weak and those who could not protect themselves, that the Babylonian captivity, Nehemiah believed, was actually something that God allowed to happen because the people had failed so miserably in doing the one thing that God expected, and that was actually caring for one another and seeking the common good. And Nehemiah was familiar with the rather robust prophetic witness, which made this very clear. In Micah chapter 3, for instance, shortly before the devastation brought by the Babylonians on the city of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah, the prophet Micah offered this message. It's rather clear. I think you'll agree. Hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob and chiefs of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe. The priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. And yet they lean upon the Lord and say, surely the Lord is with us. No harm shall come. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. So Nehemiah, part of his vision as a leader is he's filled with this idea that we really messed up before. We lost sight of the one thing that God really expected of us, and that was to build a society, a culture, a community that was characterized by justice. And we descended to a state of affairs where it was anything but that. There was no justice. There was no fairness. The rich were taking it out on the poor, and the vulnerable had no one to look after them. And that God is simply never going to bless. And so Nehemiah had the sense, well, maybe we have a new chance. Have you ever been to that point in life where you just realized you blew it? I won't ask for a show of hands. I'll just put both of my hands up for all of us. Right? We've all blown it, and we've all gotten a chance to do it again. Maybe do it right. Maybe you can think of a time in your life when you had that opportunity. Well, Nehemiah sees this as that opportunity. And the wonderful thing about Nehemiah is he not only talks the talk, but he also walks the walk. In the 5th chapter of Nehemiah, for instance, we're told that at one point he becomes aware that in response to a famine and also the rather egregious tax burden that was placed on the Jews by the Persians, that people were really suffering, and particularly the poor and the vulnerable. And the reason for this was that as they struggled to feed themselves and their families, they had to take out loans, and they were given loans that were secured by the little property they had and also by their children. So yes, times could be pretty hard in the ancient Near East. And when Nehemiah found that these people were being foreclosed on and their land was being seized, which was the only way they could support themselves, and their children were even taken as collateral, and these were Jews treating other Jews this way. Nehemiah just called it out. He exposed it, he condemned it, and he harassed everyone, particularly those in power, until they made the change and stop that practice. So you and I live in a state of affairs today where Bank of America is not going to show up when we miss a car payment and ask for our kids. And we can thank Nehemiah for that. He also refused to enrich himself with the stipend that was his by Persian law. As the leader, he was the governor, he would receive a rather generous allowance, but it would increase the tax burden on the people. He didn't want to do that. So he took care of the court retinue out of his own pocket so that an increased burden wouldn't be put on the people who were suffering and struggling already under the tax load. And we might ask the question, well, where in the world how did Nehemiah come up with this vision to commit himself absolutely to the public good, to the common good? Where did that come from? And interestingly enough, there's good reason to suspect that it actually came out of his experience being in exile. Because after the Babylonian army crushed Jerusalem and took the captives away, they found themselves hundreds of miles away from their home in a strange land. Many of them just despaired. Some of them died. Many of them were so depressed they didn't know what to do. They'd lost the land. Still others were so angry, all they could think about was getting even with the Babylonians any way they could. And the prophet Jeremiah, who was still in Jerusalem, wrote a letter to be circulated among all those who'd been carried away into captivity. And one of the things he commanded them to do was this. He wrote, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." So, you see, Nehemiah was part of that exilic community that had stayed true to that instruction by Jeremiah and realized that if you're going to be God's people, wherever you might be, whether it's Jerusalem or Shusha or anywhere else, you've got to seek the common good. And that's why so many of the Jewish exiles rose to positions of promise and real prominence. That's probably one of the reasons why Nehemiah was elevated to be cupbearer to the king of Persia. Because the Jews were known as people, as administrators, who believed God had called them to seek the common good. So I think you might agree that maybe there's something here for us today to think about. You think? I mean, is there anything here for us today? I mean, this is a Nehemiah mission trip from 2,500 years ago. I mean, maybe, is there anything there? Well, of course there is. I mean, we live in a time where I think many of us feel there's a lot of ruins about us. There's a lot of stuff that just seems to be falling around in the world. We live in a time where it seems like so many of our leaders are just pursuing their agendas at the expense of everyone. We live in a time when especially those who are poor, those who are vulnerable, are just not receiving the kind of care that they deserve. We live in a time where it seems there has been a pulling back from that fierce commitment to the common good. And if we're going to be God's people, make no mistake about this, if we're going to be God's people, it means even across all of our differences and all of our divides, we find a way to come together to seek what's just and what's right and what's good, not just for some, but for all. We are critical of ways in which we might receive benefits that others do not have access to. We have a special concern for those who most need someone to look out for them and to lift up their rights, to make sure that they're cared for. That's the vision. That's the vision that Nehemiah took on his mission trip to Jerusalem. It's also the vision that you and I are called to take out into the world this week, and the week after that, and the week after that. Amen. We invite you to get to know our community better. Take a moment and subscribe to our YouTube page, or you can go to our website, lopc.org, and find additional information there. Know that there's a place for you in our community of faith, and you'll be welcome here.